After 6 months, the Netherlands finally has a new coalition government. This came after the stunning electoral victory of Geert Wilders' Party for Freedom at the last general elections held in November of 2023. There were initially coalition talks that broke down earlier this year, but they resumed and have seemed to have been successful this time around. Now, it's not clear who will be the prime minister and all the ministerial positions. There are still some details that need to be straightened out, but it is clear that this coalition will build a majority and form the next government in the Netherlands. It will consist of Geert Wilders' right-wing Party for Freedom, the right-wing Farmer Citizen Movement, the center-right New Social Contract, and the centrist People's Party for Freedom and Democracy, the party of the former prime minister. Part of the reason the coalition talks took so long had to do with the fact that Geert Wilders and his party are seen as somewhat controversial and also outside the political mainstream. A lot of political parties and politicians had ruled out working with him or forming a coalition with his party, and after his election victory at the last general elections, they kind of had to rethink and reposition themselves. It was kind of a shock for the whole country and Europe in general. And even though there was still the potential to form a coalition against them, if you just take a look here, you won 23%, coming first place, clearly ahead of the parties in second. The third place party was the party of the former prime minister, only winning 15%. It was possible maybe to form a new center-right, centrist broad coalition like the old one that existed, with including some of the new parties, but that would have been very difficult. Had to include maybe 5-6 parties to reach a majority. There was also maybe a broad coalition that could include the center-right and the center-left, but there was problems there as well. And so when you take a look at these results, it's clear that Geert Wilders' party was in a position that it was very hard for the other parties to rule out working with him, as it was in the past when they were only at maybe 10%. And so that created the pressure for the coalition talks with Wilders to happen, but nonetheless, there were still a lot of things that needed to be worked out. There were differences on migration, differences on the EU between the different politicians, but it seems that they have kind of worked those things out and are going to form a coalition together. But what's also important to note is I feel like a lot of the pressure that existed there in these coalition talks, and a lot of the reason why they agreed to form a coalition, is when you look at the polls for the next election, that was a very bad sign for the VVD and the NSC. Now, of course, the next election won't be held for another few years. However, if there was no government formed, there was a chance of a snap election. And this is what's very important, that these politicians knew if they did not form a coalition government with Geert Wilders, it could have been potentially the case that no government was formed and we would have had new elections in the Netherlands. And if we take a look here at the results, Geert Wilders' party is polling at around 30% now, which is 7 points higher than what they got in the last election. That is a huge increase in support. I mean, 23% alone was a big victory, a lot more support than they've gotten in previous elections, more support than the VVD got in the 2021 elections. This would be a huge victory, and I think they realized that if they were to allow snap elections to be held, the position Wilders would be in would be immensely more powerful, and there would basically be no chance of them stopping or forming an alternative coalition. So they decided kind of at the last minute to go ahead and form the coalition. And we take a look here at the results for the polls. I mean, the Geert Wilders Party for Freedom is surging. They are clearly the largest party in the country, 15 points ahead of any of the second place parties. The left-wing alliance of the Social Democrats, the Labour Party, and the Greens is at around 15%, holding their own. They are at a clear second place. But we take a look here, the coalition partners, the VVD and the NSC, have dropped significantly. The VVD has lost around a third of their votes from the last election, and the NSC, which is a newly formed political party, is dropped to only around 5%. So they know if there's a new election held, they're going to lose a lot of support. And I have a feeling that had to do with some of the reasons why they probably decided to, in fact, go into this coalition, even if they're not necessarily enthusiastic about having Wilders be in power. There are some differences, and there were kind of initial expectations that they wouldn't have formed the coalition. There are some differences between Peter Omtzigt of the NSC and Wilders, but nonetheless, it has happened. And if we take a look at the polls here, we can see clearly this divide. The PVV was nowhere even near first place. Before the elections, there was different parties. There was the NSC, newly founded. There was the Farmer Citizen Movement. There was the VVD of the former prime minister. And Dutch politics, this is the case a lot, where you have many political parties, and a lot of times a political party will surge right before an election. You had the Forum and Democracy Party won the 2019 regional elections, and then the next regional elections was won by the Farmer Citizen Movement. You've had the VVD win the last general elections before the PVV. So you've had basically 4 or 5 political parties come first place in different nationwide elections within the past 5 years. And so it's a very dynamic, very fast-changing political scene, and the PVV has clearly surged not only to first place, but they have built a 15-point lead in the polls, in the polling aggregate, ahead of any of the other parties. And so so it's clear now that, even if Wilders was not able to form a coalition, now if there's snap elections held, he would most doubtedly be able to form one, maybe even be prime minister if a snap election was held and his party was able to win 33%. So that is probably part of the pressure that forced this to happen. Now, Wilders will most likely not be prime minister. They have not decided who will be the prime minister yet. It, of course, is possible. He is the leader of the largest party in the coalition. It is customary for the person that holds that position to be the prime minister. However, it is not necessarily guaranteed. So we will have to look at that in the future and see what happens. And of course, once we get more developments, I will talk about that. But there is one last aspect I want to talk about, that is how this will affect the European parliamentary elections. Of course, this is happening a few weeks before these elections. And if we look at the polls for the EU elections, it's somewhat similar to the national elections. And we can see that this will actually be very important for the Party for Freedom, because at the last EU elections, they got almost completely wiped out. They got around 3.5% of the vote. They failed to qualify for any seats in the European Parliament. And that was largely to do with the fact that the Forum for Democracy of Thierry Baudet, another right-wing populist party, similar on some of the issues, was able to win 10%, taking away a lot of votes. But if we take a look at the polls, we can see that the Party for Freedom is likely going to be able to win maybe 20% at least of the vote and be the largest party in the Netherlands, or second largest if the Labour and Greens are able to win. But nonetheless, the Party for Freedom will be able to win seats again in the European Parliament. This will be big for them. Now, this coalition talks could have some effects on the polls. There could be increase in support for some parties versus the others. That could have some effect, but nonetheless, this will be an interesting result. I think the Labour Party, of course, which did well in 2019, will do well again, especially now when they're with the Greens, and we can see who will win, whether the Party for Freedom or the left-wing alliance will win. But nonetheless, this will have an effect, and it will also likely have an effect outside of Europe. I mean, even if Wilders is not the prime minister, the fact that his party is in government with the other center-right parties might be able to bridge the gap in other European countries. For example, in Germany, it might be more legitimate now for parties from the center-right and the far-right to work together. It's not going to make it happen immediately, but it does kind of chip away at the firewall that exists between the center-right and far-right in some countries. And of course, this is important because Wilders and whoever becomes prime minister in the Netherlands will end up being, in the European Council. There'll be representation in the Commission. There will be pressure within the EU, and Wilders and also the NSC, the New Social Contract, are somewhat Eurosceptic parties. So this might be kind of a pain for the liberal EU establishment. So this will be an interesting development for them as well. But of course, this was a kind of surprise development that happened in the past few days, and I decided I wanted to make a quick video on it because, of course, I did a video covering the election results. So that's going to be it for this, and I will, of course, make more updates when we get more information about the government. If there's new snap elections that are held for any reason, or, of course, any other developments on who's going to be the prime minister. I'll probably be focusing mainly on the EU elections in the upcoming weeks, but, of course, I will talk about the EU elections in the Netherlands as well, how that reflects on what the national politics is, what that means for the future in the Netherlands. But I wanted to just kind of have this video out there for you guys, because I know that was one of the things that was asked for. But I will be making some more videos on Germany in the next few days, and of course going to the EU-wide elections, looking at it on the European-wide level, of course. And so I hope everyone liked and enjoyed this video. I will see you on the next one. Please like, share, subscribe.